In the summer of 1962, a small British car rolled off a production line in Oxford, and nobody in that factory understood what they were about to unleash. It looked ordinary, modest. The kind of car your neighbor might buy without a second thought. But within 4 years, this unassuming little saloon would become the best-selling car in the whole of Britain, and it would hold that title for the better part of a decade. And here is the part nobody tells you. The very success of this car would help hide the rot that was quietly destroying the largest car company Britain ever built. This is the story of the Morris 1100, and if you think you already know it, stay with me, because the ending is far darker than the postcard version. To understand why this car mattered, you have to go back further, to a man named Alec Issigonis. He had already given Britain the Mini, a car so clever it embarrassed every rival in Europe on price, on space, and on sheer cleverness of packaging. But Issigonis was not satisfied with one masterpiece. He believed the Mini's formula, front-wheel drive, a transverse engine, a tiny footprint, with a cavernous interior, could be scaled up into something bigger. Something a real family could actually live with day to day, not just a clever city runabout. The car market in Britain had changed in ways that made this idea almost inevitable. After the Suez Crisis of 1956, fuel had become expensive and unpredictable, and British buyers had shifted hard towards smaller, more efficient cars. The old assumption, that bigger always meant better, was starting to crack under the weight of economic reality. BMC, the British Motor Corporation, saw the opening clearly, and Issigonis was given the resources and the freedom to build the car that would fill it. What he delivered was not just another small saloon dressed up to look modern. It used a transverse engine layout mounted sideways under the bonnet, a configuration almost nobody else in the world was using at the time on a mainstream family car. It rode on something called hydroelastic suspension, a fluid interconnected system linking the front and rear units that gave it a ride quality genuinely shaming cars costing twice its price. And it achieved all of this inside a shell barely bigger than a Mini, yet somehow with real room for a family of 4 and their luggage. Motoring journalists at the time were not shy about their enthusiasm. Autocar magazine wrote that its staff had never been so unanimously excited about a car's overall qualities. That was not marketing spin. That was the honest reaction of people who tested everything on 4 wheels for a living and rarely agreed on anything. But here is where the story starts to turn. Because a car this good, this beloved, this dominant, was about to become the perfect cover story for something far less impressive happening inside the company that built it. The Morris 1100 officially launched on the 15th of August, 1962. The standard model cost £674, 15 shillings and 3 pence. The deluxe version, with twin sun visors and front door pockets, cost a little more, at £695, 7 shillings and 5 pence. For a working family climbing into the middle class in the early 1960s, that price put genuine, class-leading engineering within reach for the very first time. It arrived as a 4-door saloon for the home market, with a 2-door version built specifically for overseas customers who wanted the same clever engineering in a slightly different body. And people responded immediately. Where the Mini had been treated with a certain amount of suspicion by both dealers and buyers when it first appeared, unusual looks, an unfamiliar layout, the 1100 faced no such hesitation. The public simply took it to their hearts. Within months of launch, it was already outselling almost everything else on British roads. By 1963, it had become the best-selling car in the country. It held that position through 1964, 1965, and 1966. In 1965 alone, it captured a 14.3% share of the entire British new car market. In 1967, the Ford Cortina narrowly overtook it, but the 1100 fought back, reclaiming the top spot from 1968 through 1971, 4 years. Then another 4. Nobody else in British motoring history has matched that kind of sustained dominance. Pay attention to this part, because it matters for everything that follows. By the time production wound down in 1974, more than 2.1 million examples had been built. Over half of those were sold right there in the United Kingdom. This was not a niche success. This was the car that an entire generation of British families learned to drive in, courted in, and raised children in. If you are watching this, and you are old enough to remember queuing up outside a BMC dealership or riding in the back seat of your father's Morris on a Sunday drive, do me a favor and drop a comment below telling me which badge your family owned. And while you are here, hit subscribe, because this channel exists to dig up the real stories behind the cars that shaped Britain, the stories the glossy brochures never told you. There is a lot more coming. Now, here is where the story gets uncomfortable, because BMC did not simply sell one car under one name. They sold the very same car, mechanically almost identical underneath the skin, under 6 different badges. Morris was only the beginning. Just weeks after launch, the Austin version appeared, wearing a different fascia and a crinkle-cut radiator grille, but underneath, it was the same car. Built on the same production techniques BMC had already proven worked. In October of 1962, BMC added the MG 1100, fitted with twin carburetors for buyers who wanted a sportier badge on the bonnet without paying for an entirely different platform. By 1963, the Vanden Plas Princess joined the family, dressed up with a walnut dashboard and leather seats to appeal to buyers who wanted the feel of luxury without the price of a Jaguar. And then, in 1965, came the Riley Kestrel and the Wolseley 1100, pushing the total to 6 separate marques, all selling essentially one car under 6 different names and 6 different price points. This practice had a name: badge engineering. And on paper, it looked like genius. Why design 6 different cars when you can build one platform and simply change the grille, the seats, and the price tag? It let BMC serve 6 price points and 6 brand identities from a single production line. Short term, it was brilliant. It maximized profit from one single engineering investment made back in 1962. The company kept refining the range around the edges. A 4-speed automatic transmission became available in November of 1965. In March of 1966, estate versions arrived, the Austin 1100 Countryman and the Morris 1100 Traveller, offering the same footprint but genuinely useful load space for growing families. By late 1966, reclining front seats had become available across the range as well. But here is the part that almost nobody talks about. Every pound spent tooling up a new grille, a new dashboard, a new badge, was a pound not spent on developing the next generation of the car underneath all that trim. The 1100's basic engineering barely evolved for over a decade. While BMC's engineers were busy designing yet another version of the same wooden dashboard for yet another badge, the fundamental platform, the fundamental quality, simply stood still, while the rest of the industry kept moving forward. And there was a deeper problem hiding underneath the paint, because BMC was not investing that badge engineering profit into the one thing that actually mattered to owners over time: quality control. The 1100's biggest weakness was not its engine or its clever suspension, it was rust. The floor pan and the rear subframe were particularly vulnerable, and in Britain's damp climate, that meant a car that could look showroom fresh in its first winter and be structurally compromised within a handful of years. Owners loved how the car drove. What they did not know, what nobody told them at the time, was how quickly the metal beneath their feet could betray them. Later reviewers, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, would describe cars of this era as capable of turning into little more than crumbling rust within a single wet season if neglected. Underneath the bonnet, the A-Series engine, while proven and simple, was never dramatically developed either. Owners who kept their cars long enough often reported blue exhaust smoke as the engine wore, a telltale sign of an aging design being asked to soldier on year after year, with only minor updates, rather than the thorough overhaul a car selling in these numbers arguably deserved. None of this stopped the car from selling. In fact, that is exactly the point. The 1100 was good enough, comfortable enough, clever enough, that buyers forgave these flaws again and again. It was produced not just at Cowley and Longbridge in England, but at plants across the world, assembled in Spain, in Italy, in what was then Yugoslavia, and at the company's own factory in Belgium, with related versions built under license as far afield as Australia and South Africa. This was, by any reasonable measure, close to being a genuine world car, something the British motor industry rarely achieved before or since. Decades later, the 1100 and 1300 would even find an unexpected second life. In the 1990s, decent surviving examples were sought out and exported in significant numbers to Japan, where collectors valued exactly the qualities British buyers had come to take for granted. That clever packaging, that surprisingly sophisticated ride. But global reach and enduring appeal were never the problem. The problem was what BMC, and later British Leyland, chose to do with the enormous profits and enormous customer trust this one platform had earned them. This is where the story stops being about one car and starts being about an entire company's culture. Because in 1968, BMC merged with the Leyland Motor Corporation to form British Leyland, a giant meant to compete on the world stage against Ford, General Motors, and the rising tide of Japanese manufacturers who were only just beginning to make themselves known in Europe. And the 1100, still the country's best-selling car at that exact moment, walked straight into this new, sprawling organization as its single most valuable asset. You would think a car generating that kind of sales volume would receive serious investment to keep it sharp against new arrivals. Instead, the opposite happened. British Leyland's leadership treated the 1100's platform the way BMC always had, as a parts bin to be raided rather than a foundation to be carefully improved. The badge engineering habit did not die with the merger. It got worse. More brands under one roof meant more internal competition between divisions that were, on paper, supposed to be working toward the same goal. Meanwhile, the actual driving experience quietly declined relative to the wider industry. Rivals from Ford, and soon from Japan, were closing the gap in refinement and reliability, while the 1100's underlying engineering had barely changed since 1962. The car that had once been a genuine generation ahead of its time was slowly becoming a generation behind it, and almost nobody inside the company seemed alarmed, because the sales figures still looked healthy on paper, year after year. That is the trap. When a product is popular enough for long enough, it can mask serious structural problems for years at a time. British Leyland's management mistook commercial momentum for genuine engineering health. The 1100 was still selling because British buyers were loyal, because the brand had earned real trust throughout the 1960s. But loyalty is not infinite, and it does not renew itself automatically. Underneath the sales charts, quality control was slipping, labor relations across the wider group were deteriorating, and the company was quietly bleeding money on inefficient, badge-engineered production lines. If this is the first time you are hearing how deep this problem actually ran, make sure you are subscribed, because we are about to reach the part of this story that most car channels either skip entirely or get completely wrong. British Leyland did try to squeeze more life out of the aging platform before finally giving up on it. In September of 1971, the Austin 1100 and 1300 Mark III arrived, recognizable by their black grills, and by then, the humbler two-door deluxe version, fitted with a simplified mini-style speedometer and Spartan fittings, had become popular as a police panda car on Britain's streets. In 1972, the more expensive models even gained plastic wood effect dashboards, an attempt to inject a sense of luxury into a design that was, underneath the new trim, already a decade old. None of it was enough. By the early 1970s, the writing was on the wall, even if very few people inside British Leyland wanted to read it. Sales of the 1100 and its later 1300 variant had peaked around 1968 and 1969, and then began a slow, steady decline. Production of Morris badge saloons ceased entirely in the middle of 1971. The company's answer was not to modernize the platform that had built its reputation, it was to replace it entirely. And this is where British Leyland made the decision that historians still point to as a defining failure. Rather than evolving the 1100's basic architecture, which despite its age, still had genuine brand loyalty and what we would now call brand equity, the company chose to develop entirely new models built using older, sometimes borrowed components from elsewhere in the range. The Morris Marina arrived first, essentially a stopgap, built with a simpler, more old-fashioned rear-wheel drive layout that abandoned everything that had made the 1100 technically special in the first place. It was, by design, a retreat rather than an advance. Then came the Austin Allegro in 1973, meant to be the true successor to over a decade of accumulated brand trust. Its designer, Harris Mann, later explained that the original vision was for a sleek, modern evolution of the 1100's shape. But cost-cutting and the need to reuse existing engine and gearbox packages already sitting in British Leyland's parts bin forced compromise after compromise into the design. A heater developed at enormous expense had to be squeezed in regardless of how badly it affected the styling. The final result looked heavier and far less special than the car it was meant to replace. Here is the detail that should genuinely disturb you. British Leyland failed to understand that the 1100 was not just a good product. It was a trusted relationship with millions of British families, something the company had spent over a decade building and then simply threw away in the space of a few short years. For all its rust problems, for all its underdeveloped mechanicals, the 1100 kept selling right up until its final years in production because customers wanted, more than anything else, an improved version of a car they already trusted. Instead, British Leyland gave them something unfamiliar, less refined, and built under the exact same underinvestment culture that had let the 1100's own flaws go unaddressed for over a decade in the first place. The commercial verdict was swift and unforgiving. The Allegro never came close to matching the 1100's sales legacy, and market share that had once belonged almost automatically to British Leyland began sliding steadily toward Ford, and increasingly toward manufacturers from continental Europe and Japan, who were simply building more consistent products without the internal chaos of 6 competing badges fighting over the same production lines. So let's bring this all together. The Morris 1100 was, by almost every honest measure, one of the finest achievements of British engineering in the 20th century. Front-wheel drive years before most of the industry caught up. A ride quality that embarrassed cars costing far more. A design so clever that even its harshest critics admitted there was genuine brilliance underneath the bonnet. Over 2.1 million units built across a 12-year production run. 9 years, across 2 separate stretches, as Britain's best-selling car. That is not a small legacy. That is a car that quietly defined an entire era of British life, from the school run to the seaside holiday. But here is the lesson this story leaves behind, and it is one that reaches far beyond old British saloons and rusty subframes. Commercial success can hide structural rot for a remarkably long time, sometimes for years longer than anyone inside a company is willing to admit out loud. British Leyland's leadership had years of evidence, in the form of enormous, sustained sales, that customers trusted this platform and wanted it improved, not replaced with something unfamiliar. Instead, badge engineering profits got poured into multiplying variants rather than fixing the rust, refining the quality, and modernizing the core engineering underneath all those different grills. The very success of the 1100 became the excuse for complacency. Why fix what is clearly still selling in the hundreds of thousands every single year? That question, more than any single design flaw, is what quietly poisoned British Leyland from the inside, long before the public crisis of the later 1970s became impossible to ignore. By the time the company finally admitted the platform needed replacing, they had already lost over a decade of opportunity to evolve it gradually, the way Volkswagen would later evolve the Golf, generation after generation, without ever throwing away the accumulated trust of their existing customers. Instead, British Leyland attempted one enormous, compromised leap with the Allegro, and by the time it arrived, Japanese manufacturers were already offering British buyers something British Leyland had quietly stopped delivering years earlier: reliability, consistency, steady, honest improvement. If there is one thing to take from the story of the Morris 1100, it is this: a great product will forgive a company's mistakes for a while. It will carry a business further than that business probably deserves, but it will not forgive those mistakes forever. Success bought British Leyland time. It did not buy them a future. If this story hit you the way it hit me while researching it, I need you to do 3 things right now. Subscribe to this channel, because we are just getting started, uncovering the real stories behind the cars and companies that shaped the world you grew up in. Drop a comment below telling me what you remember most, whether it is the badge your family drove, the rust that finally caught up with it, or just the feeling of that hydroelastic ride on a wet British road. And if you know someone who remembers these cars firsthand, someone who lived through this era behind the wheel, send this video to them. Let's keep this history alive, together. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.